December 22nd, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The frost-covered earth crunched beneath his boots as Private Leo Palmer peered through the morning haze from his foxhole. 4 shapes emerged from the German lines, waving white flags. One officer clutched a briefcase under his arm. For 3 days, nearly 12,000 American troops had been completely surrounded by 5 German armored divisions. They were freezing, starving, and dangerously short on ammunition, and the Germans were about to offer them a way out. What none of the approaching German officers realized was that this encounter would spark one of the most revealing moments in military history, exposing a cultural divide so deep between armies that it defined the very essence of what made the American paratrooper distinct from every other fighting man before or since. The shift in German perception would not truly begin on this day, but the equation of American military character was being written not in surrender terms, but in a single word that would echo through time and highlight the unbridgeable gulf between Wehrmacht expectations and airborne reality. The German offensive had erupted on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler launched his final desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and seize the Belgian port of Antwerp. More than 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes forest. This surprise assault, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, marked Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. Dense woods, rolling ridges, narrow roads, and the infamous Ardennes weather created conditions that neutralized Allied air superiority. Hitler believed he could recreate the lightning triumph of 1940, when German panzers had raced through these same forests to the English Channel. Among the Wehrmacht commanders was General Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose 47th Panzer Corps had been specifically ordered to capture a small Belgian town few Americans had ever heard of, Bastogne. The town sat at the junction of 7 key roads radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Every supply line, every reinforcement column, every tactical movement in the southern Ardennes depended on controlling this crossroads. Von Luttwitz understood that Bastogne was not simply a town to be taken, but the keystone of the entire southern thrust of the German advance. The American defenders represented an improvised mix of units thrown together by necessity. The 101st Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had been resting at Mourmelon-le-Grand near Reims, France, when General Dwight Eisenhower committed his only reserve to contain the German breakthrough. On December 17th, the order came down: move to Bastogne at once. The division loaded onto trucks in the dead of night for a 107-mile journey through freezing rain and snow. They rode in open trucks, without winter clothing, without enough ammunition, without proper gear. Most paratroopers still wore the same jump uniforms they had used in Normandy 6 months earlier. Accompanying the 101st was Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, a combined force of tanks, infantry, and artillery reluctantly released from General George Patton's Third Army. These armored elements had delayed the German advance just long enough for the paratroopers to arrive. The race was measured in hours. The lead elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment rolled into Bastogne around midnight on December 19th, establishing defensive lines barely 4 hours before. German troops would have captured the town unopposed. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the 101st at Bastogne because the E Division's regular commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington when the offensive began. McAuliffe, a 46-year-old artillery officer who had graduated from West Point in November 1918 during wartime acceleration, was respected but not especially well known outside the division. His men called him Old Croc, or General Mac, and he had earned their loyalty through competence rather than charisma. What no one yet realized was that McAuliffe possessed exactly the temperament needed for the ordeal ahead. He was calm, pragmatic, and possessed a dry wit that would soon become legendary. McAuliffe organized his defenses with near-mathematical precision. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment took positions on the northwest shoulder to block the advancing 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The 506th held Noville to the northeast. The 501st guarded the eastern approaches where panzer units were already clashing with American armor. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment spread across the southern and western sectors. Engineers, clerks, and headquarters personnel filled gaps in the line. The perimeter formed a rough circle several miles across. Every unit knew they would be surrounded. The only question was whether they could hold until relief arrived. By December 20th, German forces had completely encircled Bastogne. The 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and 26th Volksgrenadier Division pressed against the Americans from all directions. Von Lüttwitz's men outnumbered the defenders roughly 5-1. The Germans held overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery, and numbers. American troops were critically short of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter gear. The weather prevented airdrops or close air support. Fog and snow cut visibility to mere yards. Temperatures plunged below freezing. By any conventional standard, the tactical outlook was grim. Yet the men of the 101st Airborne operated by principles that defied ordinary logic. They were volunteers who had endured the most rigorous training in the U.S. Army. They had jumped into Normandy in darkness, fought beyond their intended limits in the hedgerows of France, and held impossible positions during Market Garden. The airborne creed, which every paratrooper memorized, stated, "I never surrender, though I be the last. My goal in peace or war is to succeed in my mission, or die in the attempt." These were not empty words. They were a code, a culture that set paratroopers apart from every other soldier in the world. German bombardments pounded Bastogne through December 21st and 22nd. Tanks probed the American ring, searching for weak points. Infantry waves attacked again and again. The defenders fought with whatever they had. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion used its M18 Hellcat vehicles with deadly precision, knocking out roughly 40 German tanks in ambushes across the front. American artillery, expertly coordinated by McAuliffe, concentrated fire on advancing formations with uncanny accuracy. 36 150 mm howitzers in the town's center could fire in any direction, rare advantage that allowed the surrounded Americans to smash. Attacks from multiple sides, the Germans soon realized that taking Bastogne would be far more difficult than their numbers suggested. On the morning of December 22nd, around 11:30 a.m., 4 German soldiers approached the American lines south of Bastogne near the village of Remo. The group included Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmut Henke of Panzer Operations, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They carried white flags and a briefcase containing a surrender ultimatum typed on official Wehrmacht stationery. They were intercepted by an American outpost from F Company, 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The Germans were blindfolded and taken to the company command post in the woods. The note was read by Major Alvin Jones, who immediately phoned regimental headquarters. The ultimatum presented von Lüttwitz's assessment of the situation and an offer of honorable surrender. It stated that the American troops were surrounded by strong armored forces, that nearby towns had already fallen, and that there was only one chance to save the garrison from total destruction: unconditional surrender within 2 hours. Otherwise, German artillery and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions would annihilate Bastogne. Major Jones drove the message to division headquarters at the Heinz Barracks. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, entered McAuliffe's quarters to deliver the news. McAuliffe had been catching a brief rest after 3 days of near-constant command. Moore woke him and explained that the Germans had sent a surrender demand. McAuliffe's immediate response was a single word: nuts. Then he asked what exactly the Germans wanted. When told they demanded surrender or annihilation, McAuliffe laughed aloud. McAuliffe laughed aloud. The notion struck him as absurd, given that his troops had repelled every German assault so far. They had inflicted heavy casualties on enemy formations. Weather forecasts suggested clearing skies within days, which would bring both aerial resupply and devastating air support against German armor. Intelligence indicated that Patton's Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne. McAuliffe believed his men were giving the Germans one hell of a beating, and the surrender demand seemed completely disconnected from battlefield reality. Nevertheless, protocol required some form of written response to an official military communication. McAuliffe sat down with his staff to compose a reply. After several minutes of consideration, he admitted he did not know what to say. The situation was genuinely unprecedented in his experience. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, operations officer, reminded McAuliffe of his initial reaction. "You said nuts." The suggestion drew immediate applause from everyone present. Their response perfectly captured both the situation and McAuliffe's personality. He was not known for profanity. Captain Vincent Vicari, his personal aide, would later recall that General Mack was the only general who did not use profane language. Nuts was simply part of his normal vocabulary. McAuliffe wrote down the response and had it typed on official division letterhead. The message read in its entirety to the German commander Nuts, the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, volunteered to deliver the response personally. He found the two German officers still standing blindfolded in the woods under guard. Harper handed them the typed message and explained its meaning in plain English. "It means go to hell." He added that if the Germans continued to attack, American forces would kill every goddamn German that tried to break into Thessaly. The German officers saluted stiffly, turned and departed to report McAuliffe's response to their commander. The exchange revealed a fundamental disconnect between German and American military culture that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Von Lüttwitz had approached the surrender demand according to traditional European military convention. His forces held overwhelming numerical and material superiority. The Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, and facing certain destruction if they continued fighting. By the established rules of warfare that had governed European conflicts for centuries, offering honorable terms of surrender was both appropriate and expected. Von Lüttwitz anticipated that rational military commanders, faced with hopeless odds, would recognize the futility of further resistance and surrender to save their men from needless casualties. This was not cowardice, but common sense according to military traditions dating back centuries. What von Lüttwitz failed to comprehend was that American paratroopers operated according to entirely different cultural principles. The 1,001st Airborne Division had been activated on August 16, 1942 with a promise from their first commander, Major General William Lee. This division has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. The eagle patch on their shoulders symbolized their intended role as shock troops who would fall on enemies like thunderbolts from the sky. From the beginning, the division cultivated an identity separate from conventional infantry formations. The transformation into paratroopers began with jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where volunteers endured training specifically designed to eliminate those who lacked the mental toughness required for airborne operations. Physical conditioning exceeded standards for regular infantry. Parachute training involved deliberate stress to identify soldiers who would panic under pressure. The entire selection process separated men who possessed absolute commitment to the mission from those who retained any instinct for self-preservation that might interfere with combat effectiveness. Earning silver jump wings represented entrance into an elite brotherhood defined by shared hardship and mutual dependence. Paratroopers bloused their boots differently than regular infantry. They wore distinctive patches and insignia. They carried themselves with visible pride that regular infantry sometimes found arrogant. This was not accidental. The Airborne deliberately cultivated an identity as warriors who fought where others could not or would not go. The unofficial motto, non CB sed patrie, not for self, but for country, captured their self-conception as men who had volunteered to sacrifice everything for missions that regular soldiers would not attempt. Paratroopers understood themselves as fundamentally different from conventional soldiers. They jumped from aircraft behind enemy lines expecting to be surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting without support. Being encircled at Bastogne was not a crisis requiring surrender, but simply another Tuesday for men who had parachuted into Normandy in darkness while being shot at from the ground. The German concept of honorable surrender had no equivalent in airborne culture. Paratroopers were trained explicitly that surrender was never an option, regardless of circumstances. The Airborne Creed stated this principle without ambiguity. "I never surrender, though I be the last." This was not rhetoric, but operational doctrine. Paratroopers expected to fight to the death if necessary because their entire tactical concept depended on small units, holding critical objectives against overwhelming odds until conventional forces could exploit the breach. If paratroopers surrendered when surrounded, the entire operational concept of airborne warfare became meaningless. The 101st had already demonstrated this principle in Normandy, where scattered sticks of paratroopers, sometimes only 5 or 6 men, had held positions for days against German counterattacks because retreating or surrendering simply never occurred to them as possibilities. The same culture now operated at Bastogne on division scale. McAuliffe's nuts response was not defiance for theatrical effect, but straightforward communication of a fundamental cultural reality. American paratroopers do not surrender, regardless of tactical circumstances. The weather broke on December 23rd, transforming the tactical situation overnight. Clear skies allowed the Allied air forces to dominate the battlefield. C-47 transport aircraft flew over 200 supply missions to Bastogne, dropping ammunition, medical supplies, food, and winter clothing by parachute. Paratroopers who had been rationing bullets suddenly had adequate ammunition for sustained defense. Medical personnel received supplies to treat wounded soldiers who had been suffering without proper care. Fighter bombers attacked German armor and artillery positions with devastating effectiveness. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German columns and approach roads. The Luftwaffe attempted bombing raids against Bastogne on the nights of December 23rd through 26th, but the psychological impact of regained American air superiority overshadowed any physical damage the German bombers inflicted. The men of the 101st watched American aircraft filling the sky and understood that relief was inevitable. The only question was whether they could hold until Patton's forces broke through. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the Germans launched their most determined assault against the southeastern sector of the American perimeter. The attack achieved initial penetration of American lines before McAuliffe shifted reserves and concentrated artillery fire broke the German assault. The American perimeter held. That evening, McAuliffe composed a Christmas message for his troops that would become as famous as his nuts reply. He acknowledged the difficult circumstances, the cold weather, the fact they were not home for Christmas. Then he listed what the division had accomplished. They had stopped cold, everything thrown at them from north, east, south, and west. They had identified 4 German panzer divisions, 2 infantry divisions, and 1 parachute division attacking their positions. These elite German units, spearheading Hitler's last desperate offensive, had been stopped by the Eagle Division. McAuliffe concluded that by holding Bastogne, they were giving their country and loved ones a worthy Christmas present and making for themselves a truly Merry Christmas. The message captured perfectly the cultural mindset that separated paratroopers from conventional soldiers. They were not victims requiring rescue, but warriors accomplishing a mission of strategic importance. George Patton's Third Army had begun its relief operation on December 22nd, the same day McAuliffe sent his famous reply. Patton had pivoted 3 entire divisions 90 degrees from their planned offensive toward Germany and driven them north through winter conditions that would have stopped most military movements. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, spearheaded the drive to Bastogne. This division, known informally as Name Enough, because their commander believed the designation 4th Armored Division was name enough without requiring a colorful nickname, had established a reputation as Patton's most reliable armored formation. They had fought continuously since landing at Utah Beach in July and had earned Patton's confidence through consistent performance under the most demanding circumstances. The advance toward Bastogne faced determined German resistance. The 4th Armored fought through multiple defensive positions, seized towns against counterattacks, and maintained pressure despite casualties and mechanical breakdowns. Combat Command attacked up the main highway from Ardennes, while Combat Command B advanced along secondary roads to the west. Combat Command Reserve prepared to exploit any breakthrough either column achieved. On December 26th, Combat Command Reserve, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, made the final push toward Bastogne. The attack jumped off from Remy-Champagne, approximately 6 meters southwest of the encircled town. American artillery, involving 13 artillery batteries, fired a massive barrage on German positions in and around the village of Assène-Noire, the last obstacle before Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion with Company C reduced to just 9 operational. Sherman tanks led a column of armor and mechanized infantry straight through Assène-Noire in what participants described as a hell-for-leather charge through heavy German resistance. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus commanded the lead. Sherman tank-designated Cobra King with bumper number C6. His tank crew navigated through Assène-Noire, while infantry fought house-to-house battles against German defenders. Private James Hendris of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division Relief Force, won the Medal of Honor for single-handedly destroying 2 German 88mm gun positions and a machine gun nest while rescuing wounded soldiers from burning vehicles during the relief operation. The relief column broke through at approximately 1650 hours on December 26th. First Lieutenant Bogus shook hands with First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, symbolically ending the siege of Bastogne. Cobra King and the following vehicles established a corridor into Bastogne that allowed supply convoys to reach the defenders and evacuate wounded soldiers. The reaction of the 101st Airborne Division to Patton's arrival exposed the profound cultural divide that the Nuts reply had previewed. Conventional military analysis described Patton's Third Army as rescuing the besieged paratroopers. Newspaper reports celebrated the dramatic relief of surrounded American forces. Military historians would later credit Patton's rapid maneuver and aggressive tactics with saving the 101st from destruction. The paratroopers themselves rejected this narrative completely and permanently. At McAuliffe's press conference in Paris on January 2, 1945, he spoke for every soldier who had defended Bastogne. He never asked for help. He screamed about only one thing, and that had to do with casualties. They needed surgeons. The distinction was crucial. The 1001st had never requested relief from encirclement because being surrounded was not a crisis requiring rescue. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division incurred 53 total casualties. The 4th Armored Division lost approximately 1,000 men killed and wounded during the relief operation. These numbers, while significant, were far lower than German losses. The VIH committed elite Panzer and Volks grenadier formations to capturing Bastogne and suffered devastating casualties for no strategic gain. The Americans held the crossroads throughout the critical phase of the German offensive. By the time German forces finally broke contact and withdrew, Hitler's last gamble had failed. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in World War II, with total American casualties estimated between 75,000 and 89,000, including between 8,600 and 19,000 killed, depending on methodology and date ranges used. The defense of Bastogne represented a turning point where determined resistance by outnumbered forces prevented German breakthrough and bought time for Allied counteroffensive operations. The German surrender ultimatum and McAuliffe's reply exposed differences far deeper than mere tactical situations von Lüttwitz operated. According to military traditions where officers considered the welfare of their men when making decisions about continuation of hopeless fights, surrender in the face of overwhelming odds was not cowardice, but responsible command that preserved soldiers' lives for future battles. This tradition made sense in European context, where wars were fought by professional armies that represented national investments. Losing an army meant losing the war, so commanders balanced objectives against preservation of combat power. American paratroopers operated according to completely different cultural principles derived from frontier traditions, volunteer military service, and deliberate cultivation of warrior identity separate from civilian society. Paratroopers were not professional soldiers serving for pay, but volunteers who chose to fight in the most dangerous circumstances available. They self-selected for missions where death was likely and survival depended entirely on absolute commitment to mission accomplishment. Surrender was not an option because men who volunteered to jump from aircraft into enemy fire had already accepted death as probable outcome. The mission was everything. Personal survival was secondary. This cultural framework was incomprehensible to German commanders raised in Prussian military tradition, where officers were responsible for their men's welfare. McAuliffe's nuts reply communicated across this cultural divide with perfect clarity. The single word contained multiple meanings. It rejected surrender explicitly. It expressed contempt for the suggestion that surrounded paratroopers might consider quitting. It communicated absolute confidence that American forces would prevail regardless of German threats. Most importantly, it demonstrated that American commanders did not share German assumptions about rational military behavior. Von Lüttwitz expected commanders to calculate odds and recognize when continued fighting became pointless. McAuliffe operated according to principles where odds were irrelevant if the mission required holding position. The nuts reply was not bravado or propaganda, but straightforward communication that American paratroopers and German Panzerschwere playing entirely different games according to incompatible rules. The Germans brought overwhelming force, expecting logical surrender. The Americans brought cultural commitment to never surrendering regardless of circumstances. These positions could not be reconciled through negotiation, only through combat. The fighting continued for weeks after December 26th, when Patton's forces broke the encirclement. The corridor into Bastogne remained narrow and vulnerable to German counterattacks. The 101st transitioned from defensive operations to offensive attacks against German positions surrounding the town. Villages that had been abandoned during the initial German advance, including Foy and Neuville, were retaken through systematic assaults in brutal winter conditions. The division was not withdrawn from combat until mid-January, when the German offensive had been definitively defeated, and Wehrmacht forces were retreating across the frontier into Germany. Even then, paratroopers departed Bastogne not as survivors grateful for rescue, but as warriors disappointed their pursuit of retreating Germans was being interrupted. This attitude pervaded every level of the division, from private soldiers to general officers. The cultural principles displayed at Bastogne were not unique to that battle, but represented consistent patterns throughout the 101st Airborne Division's combat history. In Normandy, scattered paratroopers fought for days in small groups because regrouping with parent units never occurred to them as more important than accomplishing assigned missions. During Operation Market Garden in Holland, the 101st held objectives for longer than planned operations specified because the mission was to hold until relieved, and they would continue holding regardless of how long relief required. At Bastogne, surrounded by 5 German divisions, the response was identical. accomplish the assigned mission regardless of circumstances. This consistency demonstrated that airborne culture was not situational adaptation to specific tactical problems, but fundamental identity that governed how paratroopers understood their role. The volunteer nature of service reinforced this culture. Every man wearing jump wings had chosen this path knowing exactly what it entailed. Nobody was drafted into the airborne. Soldiers who wanted easier service could have remained in conventional infantry units. Choosing to become a paratrooper meant accepting that you would fight in the worst possible circumstances, and that surrender would never be considered as option. This self-selection created units where every soldier shared commitment to principles that outsiders found extreme or even irrational. Their refusal to admit needing rescue became permanent part of 1001st Airborne culture and identity. Decades later, this attitude remained so fundamental that it appeared in popular media. The Band of Brothers television series concluded its Bastogne episode with on-screen text, noting that while historians credit Patton with rescuing the 100, no member of the division has ever agreed they needed rescuing. This statement, appearing in a dramatic production, testified to how completely the cultural principle had been absorbed into divisional identity. Even veterans who were children during World War II and joined the 101st decades after Bastogne inherited the cultural understanding that paratroopers do not require rescue when surrounded, because being surrounded is normal operating environment for airborne forces. The attitude transcended specific battles or wars to become permanent part of organizational culture passed from generation to generation of soldiers who wore the screaming eagle patch. The press coverage of Bastogne created tensions between public perception and how participants understood events. Newspapers celebrated Patton's dramatic dash to rescue surrounded paratroopers, creating narrative of cavalry arriving in the nick of time to save beleaguered defenders. This made excellent copy and fit established patterns of heroic military stories. The men of the 101st resented this characterization because it portrayed them as victims requiring rescue rather than warriors accomplishing mission. McAuliffe repeatedly emphasized in press conferences and interviews that his division never asked for help and never felt they needed rescuing. The only urgent request was for medical personnel to treat casualties, which was logistical support rather than combat rescue. This distinction seemed pedantic to journalists and public audiences, who naturally viewed surrounded troops as requiring relief. But to paratroopers, the distinction captured everything essential about their identity and the cultural principles that made airborne operations possible. If paratroopers admitted needing rescue when surrounded, it would invalidate the entire concept of airborne warfare, where small units regularly operate behind enemy lines, expecting to be surrounded and outnumbered. The transformation that Bastogne revealed was not change in German military capabilities or American tactical doctrine, but exposure of unbreakable cultural divide between military traditions. German forces fought according to Prussian military principles refined over centuries, emphasizing rational calculation, professional competence, and officer responsibility for soldiers' welfare. American paratroopers fought according to frontier warrior tradition, emphasizing individual courage, absolute mission commitment, and voluntary acceptance of death as probable outcome. These traditions produced completely different operational behaviors when facing identical tactical circumstances. German commanders surrounded at Stalingrad had eventually surrendered after extended siege because continued fighting became militarily pointless. American paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne never considered surrender because tactical circumstances were irrelevant to mission accomplishment. The contrast illuminated profound differences in how cultures understood warfare, military service, and relationship between soldiers and missions. McAuliffe's nuts reply became one of the most famous military communications in American history, precisely because it captured this cultural principle so perfectly. The single word contained entire philosophy of military service that separated volunteers who who choose dangerous missions from conventional soldiers serving because required. It expressed contempt for enemy threats that assumed American commanders calculated odds like German officers. It communicated absolute confidence that American forces would prevail regardless of tactical disadvantages. Most importantly, it demonstrated that paratroopers operated according to different rules than enemies expected. Von Lüttwitz offered surrender terms, assuming rational commanders would recognize hopeless situation. McAuliffe replied with word that meant his forces would fight to last man because surrender was never option, regardless of circumstances. This communication gap extended far beyond Bastogne to represent fundamental difference in how American and German militaries understood combat operations. The legacy of Bastogne influenced American military culture for subsequent generations. Every paratrooper who earned jump wings after World War II learned the story of McAuliffe's reply and the division's refusal to admit needing rescue. The narrative became teaching tool for instilling airborne culture in new volunteers. If you want to be paratrooper, you must internalize principles demonstrated at Bastogne, where surrounded men with limited supplies fought elite German forces to stand still because mission required holding position. No other reason was necessary. No calculation of odds mattered. The mission was everything. This cultural principle, transmitted through training and organizational tradition, created consistent operational behaviors across decades of service. The 1001st Airborne Division earned designation as most deployed division in United States. Army not through superior equipment or tactical innovation, but through cultural commitment to accomplishing impossible missions through sheer determination. That culture traced directly back to December 22, 1944, when McAuliffe wrote single word that defined what separated paratroopers from every other soldier who ever fought. The post-war years saw many of the Bastogne veterans rise to prominence in civilian life and military service. McAuliffe himself was promoted to Major General on January 3, 1945, just one day after his Paris press conference. He continued serving in the Army, commanding the 103rd Infantry Division in Europe and later serving as commander of United States Army Europe. He retired as a full general in 1956 and died on August 11, 1975, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center at age 77. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery alongside his wife, Helen. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who suggested using nuts as the official reply, Rosato Lieutenant General and commanded United States forces in Vietnam. Colonel Creighton Abrams, who led the relief column, eventually became Army Chief of Staff, and the M1 Abrams main battle tank was named in his honor. Countless other veterans of Bastogne served with distinction in Korea, Vietnam, and throughout the Cold War, carrying with them the cultural lessons learned in those frozen Belgian forests. The German officers who delivered and received the surrender ultimatum faced very different fates. General Heinrich von Lüttwitz surrendered to American forces in April 1945 and spent several years ASA prisoner of war. He was never charged with war crimes and lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1969. Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henker, who delivered the ultimatum under white flag, survived the war and returned to civilian life in Germany. In post-war interviews, German officers consistently expressed bewilderment at the American refusal to surrender at Bastogne. From their perspective, the tactical situation clearly warranted capitulation. The fact that American forces not only refused, but continued fighting with undiminished determination represented a cultural phenomenon they could not comprehend within their own military framework. This incomprehension extended beyond individual officers to the Wehrmacht institution. German military planning for the Ardennes offensive had not anticipated encountering forces that would fight to the last man in hopeless tactical situations. The cultural assumptions embedded in German military doctrine, where rational calculation governed command decisions, proved inadequate when confronting American paratroopers who operated according to entirely different principles. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when Allied forces had pushed German units back to their starting positions along the German border. The offensive cost Germany irreplaceable losses in men, tanks, and aircraft that could not be replaced. The final German reserve had been committed and destroyed in a desperate gamble that achieved nothing. For the Allies, the battle represented the largest and costliest engagement. American forces would fight in Europe, but it also demonstrated the resilience and fighting quality of American soldiers when tested under the most adverse conditions. The defense of Bastogne became the emblematic moment of this larger battle, the point where American determination proved stronger than German material advantage. When historians analyze why the Ardennes offensive failed, they cite multiple factors, including weather, logistics, Allied air power, and German fuel shortages. But the foundational reason was simpler. The offensive required capturing Bastogne quickly to maintain momentum, and the American paratroopers defending that town would not surrender regardless of circumstances. Everything else followed from that basic reality. The mathematics of airborne culture were written not in tactical manuals, but in accumulated decisions by individual soldiers who faced death and chose mission accomplishment over personal survival. Each paratrooper who held position at Bastogne, when surrounded and outnumbered, reinforced cultural principle that surrender was never option. Each artillery crew that remained at guns despite German attacks validated cultural understanding that weapons were fired until destroyed or victorious. Each medic who treated wounded under fire demonstrated cultural priority that mission casualties received care even when personal survival required abandoning position. These individual decisions multiplied across nearly 12,000 soldiers over 8 days of combat created organizational culture stronger than any German assault. Von Lüttwitz could threaten annihilation with artillery and armor. He could not break culture that defined soldiers by their absolute refusal to surrender regardless of threats. This was why the surrender ultimatum failed so completely. German commander approached negotiations assuming rational military calculation. American paratroopers responded according to cultural principles, where dying rather than surrendering was normal expectation of service. No negotiation was possible across that divide. The final evaluation shows that American success at Bastogne resulted not from superior tactics, firepower, or generalship, but from an unbridgeable cultural gulf between the two armies. German forces held overwhelming material and numerical advantages. They should have annihilated American positions through continuous artillery barrages and coordinated tank assaults. Yet they faced an opponent who refused to fight by conventional logic. The paratroopers fought with absolute dedication to completing their mission, regardless of personal sacrifice. They never faltered despite dire conditions. They never entertained surrender despite a formal offer of honorable terms. They maintained their positions not because help arrived, but because their ethos demanded they hold until death or victory. Material superiority proved meaningless against soldiers who refused to recognize that superiority as relevant to their choices. This was the ultimate lesson of Bastogne. Culture can outweigh tactics. Warriors who accept death as routine cannot be defeated by enemies who assume rational calculation governs behavior. In the end, Bastogne demonstrated that the most decisive weapon in war is not firepower or maneuver, but cultural conviction that transcends circumstance. The 101st Airborne Division overcame the German offensive through a superior mindset that defined them as warriors who never surrender. McAuliffe's nuts reply was not theatrical defiance, but an honest reflection of a cultural truth the Germans could not grasp. American paratroopers do not surrender. No qualifications, no exceptions. This principle rendered tactical calculations irrelevant. Surrounded units kept fighting because encirclement was normal. Outnumbered troops held their ground because numbers meant nothing to mission success. Low ammunition led to rationing, not surrender. Every problem demanded a solution that excluded quitting. This mindset made the 101st Airborne Division 1 of the most formidable fighting forces in military history, not through superior equipment or training, but through beliefs that erased defeat as a possibility. They fought at Bastogne as they had everywhere else, utterly devoted to completing their mission, no matter the cost. That was why they refused to admit needing rescue. To be rescued implied they were victims. They were warriors fulfilling their duty. That distinction defined everything that made them airborne. They defended that distinction as fiercely as they defended Bastogne, because both represented the same truth. American paratroopers never surrender, never quit, and never require saving. They volunteered precisely to fight where ordinary soldiers would fail. That was their identity, their purpose, and their lasting legacy from 8 frozen days in December when they held a crossroads and refused to accept that the task was impossible. The Germans offered them escape. They answered, "Nuts." Everything that followed sprang from that word, from that absolute rejection of surrender, from that unshakable devotion to mission over survival. That was the culture of the American paratrooper. That was why they held Bastogne. That was why they never admitted needing rescue. And that remains their enduring legacy.